Well, hey everyone, I am Antoine Trammell, and I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Dr. Aaron Colverson. Dr. Colverson graduated from Berklee College of Music in 2009 with a degree in professional music, where he focused on jazz violin performance. After Berklee, he moved to Nairobi, Kenya, where he lived for 2 years to learn about East African musical traditions and cultures. Following his time in Kenya, he obtained a PhD in ethnomusicology from the University of Florida, and he also conducted neuropsychological research. In his postdoctoral work, he obtained a fellowship to study music and prosocial engagement in Alzheimer's disease. That also included training at the Global Brain Health Institute and Memory and Aging Center at UCSF. At present, Dr. Colverson is an affiliate faculty member at the University of Florida Center for Arts and Medicine, where he collaborates on numerous projects in their interdisciplinary research lab. So, Dr. Colverson, we welcome you. We're all eager to hear what you have to share with us today. Are you going to run your slides, or is Marissa going to advance them?
Marissa will.
Okay. After your presentation, we'll have a Q&A session. So to all of our guests, please feel free to submit your questions. All right, Dr. Colverson, I'm looking forward to your talk.
Thanks very much, Dr. Trammell. Thank you so much, Dr. Parker, to Marissa, and also to Dr. Davis for this opportunity, and also to John for this opportunity to join you all today. I don't know about y'all at home, and I see there are many of us on the call today, but I was just moving. Oh my gosh, that was so much fun. What an amazing activity. And I get the honor to present a little bit of work associating maybe some of the activities that we were just engaging in there with our minds, and maybe ways in which those activities could be healthy for our minds, particularly as we continue aging. So I'm joining you all today from San Francisco, California, where I'm working on a postdoctoral fellowship at the Memory and Aging Center. The institution is called University California, San Francisco, and we're designing some interventions to look at ways in which music may be helpful for people living with dementia. So the images in front of you here are my journey on this path to learning about relationships between music and dementia. The image on the left is of my father, who in 2014 was diagnosed with a disease called frontotemporal dementia, particularly behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia. And in 2016, he passed away from complications with that disease. The image on the right is a mug that he created for my brother's wedding. If you may know the film The Lord of the Rings, this comes from that film. It's a particular moment in the film when the hobbits are drinking some beer with the humans of the script, and they say this phrase, "It comes in pints." And it's sort of a really exciting moment for the hobbits, these sort of miniature individuals, to know that they can get a bigger beer than the one that they previously thought was available to them. So I put these images together to show you that for my dad, art was a really important part of his life. And further importantly, music was a very important part of his life. He particularly listened to the Dire Straits and the Rolling Stones. He was an English gentleman himself, and so those bands were very familiar to him, music that meant a lot to him. And these are some things that we're going to explore today: familiarity, memory, things that music can facilitate, as well as the arts more broadly. Marissa, if you could please advance the slide. So here I am. We're going to talk about these combinations of music and particularly, oh, sorry, if you might slip back to the previous slide. Okay, thank you. Music and the aging mind. And I hope this image on the right can kind of get you to think a little bit about all the different ways that music can be practiced, right? We have keyboards, we have guitars, there's percussion, there's a microphone, there's a lot of different things that music involves, and all of those somehow relate back to our minds. So if you would please advance the slide. All right, and one more. So the first thing to consider here is music itself in relation to aging and the brain and mind. But notice in parentheses, we have this phrase king next to the word music. I'll explain a little bit more about why that's there. If you could please advance the next one. And the second learning objective for today is to try and incorporate musicking. So that's that previous word we saw with culture in relation to aging, the brain, and mind health. One more advance. We're going to now focus in on this first learning objective. And one more slide, please. All right, so what exactly is this idea? If you could press the button. It looks kind of like a strange word, at least to me when I first was exposed to it, but let's break it down. So first of all, you can see the word music. Music's a noun. And then there's this other phrase, king, next to it. They're put together, suggesting that instead of it being a noun anymore, music, it's now a verb. It's something that we do. And by we, I mean humans, something that humans have engaged with for as long as maybe we know that humans have been on planet Earth. This suggests there's a lot of different ways in which people engage with musicking. Maybe they perform it. Maybe we listen to it. Maybe it's something that you simply do backstage while someone else is about to perform. Maybe you're sitting in a studio and you're preparing some music on your computer that will be shared with a film later on. All of these are kind of examples of ways in which musicking is part of human life, something that we do, something that we engage with. So I hope this can kind of provide you with a little bit of a conceptual framework around combining the noun music with this idea of a gerund, right? Turning a noun into a verb, something that we do. If you can please advance the slide. Okay, so now let's think about musicking in the brain. This particular example comes from a publication by Sebastian Kolsch, a researcher that has been in this field of music in the brain for many decades, and in 2014 came out with a very important publication in Nature Reviews Neuroscience. So the visual on the right is a lot of information. I can understand that maybe for many of us, it's too much information. So let's break it down a little bit to understand what's going on. Notice that there's a human ear on the visual. And from that human ear, there are three colored lines that are coming from it. One line is orange or gold, one line is green, and another line is purple. Each one of those lines, if you move your eyes down to the bottom of that visual, represents a different type of processing that occurs in the brain based upon the ways in which the brain understands music or musical sound. So for example, that gold line or orange line, as you can see, is associated with a pathway that then links into a lot of other, much more higher order processing that the brain engages in order to understand music itself. Notice that those gold lines coming from the initial one go to behavioral and psychological outcomes, motor outcomes, sensory outcomes, emotional, and cognitive. And each one of those other pathways that are next to the gold ones relate in some way to those outcomes, again, cognitive, emotional, and so on, suggesting that in our brains, when we do activity with music, musicking, there's a whole bunch of activity going on. Well, this is a really important thing for us to understand more and for us to study. If you could please advance the slide. So recently, in 2020, there was a book published associating music, not musicking, but music, which they relate, to the aging brain. And in that book, if you could please press the button forward, there were a lot of different topics covered. As I mentioned from the previous slide, music engages the brain in a very multimodal way, right? Cognitive, emotional, sensory, motor. And so topics that are included in this book think about music very broadly, pitch, timing, as well as emotion. But if you could press the button forward, it also provides a quote that I think is very critical for our takeaway message from today around ways in which music might be healthy for the aging brain. The quote is, "New encounters with music may lead to new values, maybe new interpretations. In turn, music can be processed and interpreted differently as people get older. This age-related difference may not necessarily reflect a deficit." I think this is a really important quote, such that if you think about music and dementia, which is a topic that maybe many of us are aware of or exposed to, oftentimes we think about dementia as a deficit in processing. But one thing that's so critical for the aging brain with music is that we don't necessarily lose our faculties to process music. Perhaps you know of anecdotes of individuals living with dementia that then listen to music in some ways, and they can relate back to a moment in their past that's incredibly familiar, incredibly stimulating, and actually lead to connections with their caregivers. If you're interested in that topic, I have a lot more information that I could provide, and we could follow up on that. But I wanted to give you this example to show you that there's a whole book written on ways in which music and the aging brain connect. If you could please press the button. Herein lies one limitation from my read of the overarching aspects of this book, that non-Western music, and by non-Western, I'm mostly referring to music outside of the United States and Europe. So we can think about Latin American music, African music, Asian music. These are not necessarily included in some of the research studies that are trying to associate music with the aging brain and or music with aging brain health. So something to also remember from this book. If you could please advance the slide. All right, so we revisit our learning objectives. One more, please. So we've just considered and defined music king in relation to the aging brain and mind. One more, please. Now we'll start to look at this relationship between musicking and culture in relation to the brain and mind health. So one more, just to focus in on this particular learning objective, again, incorporating these ideas into one another. And please advance the slide. Okay, so musicking and culture. Well, this is quite a combination of things. We've already considered musicking as this very broad topic of ways in which we engage with music, doing music, making music, listening to music. So many examples. Well, culture is arguably equally as amorphous a topic of something to consider, something to study, in particular in a research context. For me, from the training that I've received in ethnomusicology, which ethnomusicology is the study of music in culture, one of the definitions that we received for the term culture is shared and learned practices. So think about that for a second. Shared and learned practices may associate with a host of things. In the context of music, as you can see on the screen here, perhaps you learn certain ways to dance to the music that is part of your culture. Perhaps there's certain clothing that's involved, certain ways in which people engage with that music in terms of maybe a power hierarchy, who has control over certain aspects of the musical sound. These are all really interesting dynamics that may link back in some way to our minds, particularly how the mind may process music differently depending on the culture in which you originate from. This idea is something that I'd like to explore further with you all in this presentation through an exercise that we'll engage with in a moment. If you could please advance the slide. So here comes something that I think is really interesting and something that I would really like for you guys to consider further from this presentation. If we combine musicking with culture, in this instance, some sort of cross-cultural situation, we do live in the 21st century and there's all opportunities to expose ourselves through the internet to music from many, many, many different cultures. Would that associate in some way with brain health? Well, I think so. And theoretically, the cognitive resources that are associated with listening to and relating to music that may be familiar to you may be very different than the cognitive resources that might associate with music that's unfamiliar to you. Think about that for a second. Perhaps the attention that's required to pay to music that's different, well, all of a sudden it's an unfamiliar sound. Maybe there's an instrument that's different, a rhythm that's different. Perhaps the movement that the performer is giving in a video of that music might be very unfamiliar to you. Well, it would suggest that you're going to have to pay attention to those sounds and those visuals differently than if you're paying attention to music that's familiar to you. So we need to test this idea. This is a theoretical assumption. Okay, please advance the slide. Enter a concept called neuroplasticity. Perhaps some of you are familiar with this idea, perhaps some of you are not. So let's briefly break it down. Neuroplasticity refers to this idea of the brain's ability to adapt to its circumstances, its surroundings, its environment. And so in the concept of musicking, in relation to neuroplasticity, there's been quite a bit of work done. Here's a collage image of some of the studies. I realize that I'm not providing you with the exact titles, but some of these key words in this collage associate these concepts to one another, suggesting that there is quite a bit of research done to try and understand these ideas. So how might neuroplasticity and musicking relate back to this idea of culture and how exposing ourselves to unfamiliar sounds may change our brains or our minds in some way that could be beneficial, healthful? This is an interesting question, one that I would argue has not been tested very much in the research to date, and where there's a lot of room and space to step outside of these largely Western-focused theoretical advances that we've had in research into more non-Western spaces that might then associate with this unfamiliarity piece, this possibility for neuroplasticity, and chances for brain health. If you could please advance the slide. So I've talked a lot. I would like for us now to listen to some music and think about these questions that are on the screen. So, is this piece familiar to you? Have you heard it before? How does it make you feel? Does it make you feel anything if it is familiar or unfamiliar? Do you have any memories that might come to mind from listening to this piece? These are guiding questions for the listening, and we'll move on from there to another exercise. Okay, please press play. Pause it, Marisa. Okay, thanks very much. And if you could please advance the slide. All right, before you press play on this one, I just want to again mention that I was assuming that us on this call today may have been familiar with that piece of music. That was Beethoven's. Beethoven is a composer in the classical Western European musical literature who composed this symphony, his fifth symphony, and that particular melody that was played, right, da 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 da, is one that has been around in certainly the United States and much of Western Europe for well over a century. So again, I'm assuming that music might have been familiar to you. Now, I'm also assuming that the upcoming music might be unfamiliar to you. And I say this idea of familiarity and familiarity, excuse me, very broadly. Perhaps aspects of the music that we just heard were familiar or unfamiliar. Perhaps aspects of this upcoming example may be familiar or unfamiliar. This is an important level of nuance that I think is important to note. Okay, Marissa, if you could please play this example. Please pause this one. All right. So before advancing to the next slide, I again reiterate, I'm assuming that this particular example might be unfamiliar to many of us. But again, perhaps aspects of it are familiar. There was a comment in the chat that mentioned drum lines, which probably is a memory for that individual that they associate with visualizing here and also hearing this sound and processing it in terms of musical sound and visuals that they've been exposed to previously. Even though the context might be different, aspects of that sound might be familiar and stimulate some memories that would associate. Okay, if you could please advance the slide. Okay, so a little bit of reflection. Maybe both of those selections were familiar to you. Maybe both of those selections were unfamiliar to you. Maybe they stimulated some memories. Maybe they didn't. Now it comes to the last question for reflection, though. If unfamiliar, would listening regularly help you to make sense of those sounds, create some level of familiarity, and perhaps change connections in your brain? This is an interesting question, one that could be testable from a research perspective. Hypothetically, we could design a study to address those elements and lead to some levels of conclusions that could perhaps advance some of the science around neuroplasticity, around aging brain health, and more broadly, trying to understand benefits of musicking, right? Engaging with music in some way, and the outcomes that we're looking for health, particularly in the brain. Okay, if you could please advance the slide. This leads to another hypothetical or theoretical assumption, one that I was just trying to get at with addressing that last question, that were we to engage in some way in cross-cultural musicking, in this example that was provided for listening, we had a Western European classical symphonic work, and then we had a public presentation of a drum line in the context of Colombia, the country. Very, very different contexts smashed into one another and compared in some way in terms of the feelings, the memories, the stimulations that might have come from listening to those. Perhaps if you were to associate that over time with some level of neuroplasticity in the brain, it could lead to what is called in the literature cognitive reserve. Theoretical assumption. As far as I'm aware, I've not seen examples of these kinds of combinations in research that have actually led to this outcome, but perhaps they do. There are bases to assume this theory could be testable and potentially even lead to addressing hypotheses that might associate with this outcome. Cognitive reserve refers to some level of capability of the brain to ward off insult in some way or another. Now, if you were to be given a genetic disease like Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's, anything under that umbrella of dementia, perhaps cognitive reserve might not be as efficacious as an individual who's going down more of a healthy aging track without disease and has more ability to maintain that health throughout the aging process. Well, I'm assuming here through this theory that maybe with listening to music that's unfamiliar, you might be able to effectively address some of these cognitive reserve issues and maintain health longer. Something to test. If you could please advance the slide. So here's a culmination of this idea, okay? And let's start from right to left with these different images, okay? So on the right, again, we revisit our brain image of all the different activity that occurs in the brain in order to process music. We have cognitive aspects, emotional aspects, sensory, motor, behavioral, and psychological. And if you associate these activities in the brain with the idea of culture, well, it could very well be that it could lead to some changes in the brain that could be healthful. These are possibilities considering the book's quote that was mentioned: new encounters with music may lead to new values and ways of interpreting music differently. So I associate these images together as sort of a takeaway message for you all today, that perhaps listening to music that's unfamiliar to you may be beneficial for your brain health. That's what I've prepared for my presentation for today. I'd love to open up the floor for questions or for discussion, and also just give an invitation to you all to reach out to me if you're interested in talking more about these topics. Many, many people are engaged with these interacting ideas, and I'm certainly not the only one. It's a field that's developing here in the United States. And I really thank, again, Dr. Parker, Dr. Davis, Dr. Trammell, and also Ms. Hart for the organization behind this entire series. It's a really great honor to be part of this. Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. There looks like there is a question in the Q&A section. Have you read I Heard There Was a Secret Chord by Daniel Levitin?
Hmm. So I need to answer that directly and say the book itself I have not read. However, Leonard Cohen's music, Hallelujah, is one that for me is very familiar and very touching and meaningful. So I'd like to at least answer the question in that way by saying what a gorgeous and meaningful piece of music to many. And also so lovely that Dr. Levitin has written a book to honor that work.
Someone wants to know where can I find the recording? I missed the beginning. Oh, I think that's about the presentation in general. I believe this will eventually be on our YouTube channel. You can find it there. Now, although I have
Uh,
go ahead, Crystal.
Dr. Parker, great presentation. Um, what can those of us who are listening to you do with music in our lives, whatever music it is we like to listen to, that will help our brains at this point in time?
Yeah, thanks. So I think that the movement piece was really critical. So when we introduced the session today with John's, I thought, really brilliant organization of the different types of movement that could be done in a chair, I really appreciated how music was this stimulus that might then lead to the movement. And I would encourage that that kind of activity could be very healthy over time. I also would encourage exposing yourself to sounds that you might be unfamiliar with. Some of the emotional responses that you might get to those sounds could be very beneficial. For example, say that you listen to a sound that you wouldn't necessarily otherwise listen to. Perhaps it's music from Arabia, as an example. The instrument that might be played there could be one that's unfamiliar and maybe even sound kind of bad. Maybe you wouldn't like it. Well, that's an important reaction. That's something that is different, an experience that's different for you than you might not previously have been exposed to. And I would argue that that different experience could be beneficial because it provides for you a thought process and an engagement, a stimulation that otherwise your body and mind might not necessarily have been exposed to. I would argue that that could be healthy.
There is a comment from Tammy Harp that her mother would recommend people to sing after a stroke. They have to sing to get well.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
that's beautiful. You know that. So from a well, let me say from an intervention perspective, singing with people who have had insults to their brains or their bodies is a very accessible way to physically participate in musicking, right? Somehow or another, engaging with music. And I love that that example was given for stroke recovery because sometimes speech-based interventions or language-based interventions don't always associate with the outcome that the researcher and or clinician or if a team of are trying to reach. Sometimes speech-based interventions are not accessible. The individual cannot necessarily produce the word or the syllable or the sentence, whatever the stimulus may be, but singing is somehow still accessible. And I think this is such a brilliant example with stroke. Obviously, it depends on where the stroke has occurred, but in the image that's still up on our slide deck here, that right image again of what's going on in music in the brain. Notice that the innervation are those first three lines that enter into the brain. It goes through subcortical systems. Subcortical systems are systems that tend to be, this is very, very, well, one could argue differently, but subcortical systems are ones that don't necessarily get impaired by neurodegenerative disease equally as to what occurs earlier on. For example, in Alzheimer's disease, it's neocortical systems that get affected, tends to be in the front and also sort of rear of the brain, parietal regions. And even in Parkinson's disease, which does affect subcortical systems, there's still benefit to using musical sound, particularly musical rhythm, to help with symptom management. There's quite a bit of research done on the benefits of that example. And singing seems to be another one wherein language faculties that may get affected by either neurodegeneration or stroke are still somehow maintained, perhaps through this innervation of subcortical to cortical. That's an assumption that I cannot speak to because I do not study that particular area, but I would argue this might be one of the ways that singing is still a faculty that's maintained despite that insult.
Dr. Colverson, is there a difference in the response, perhaps, of listening to music versus playing an instrument? And is it even better if someone starts learning and playing instruments earlier in life? Because we know that cognitive stimulation over the course of a lifetime is something that leads to or promotes cognitive reserve.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Dr. Trammell. So, the one important way to respond to that is both listening and playing have benefits. There are good ways to associate listening with outcomes that one might want in terms of, again, the response that an individual may have to be positive, particularly if they like listening to that music. Well, that might make them smile, that might make them laugh, that might make them make more eye contact with you if you're caring for them, for example. Now, in terms of playing, though, uh, the physical engagement with musical sound would require, arguably, synchronization with your peripheral nervous system. So that's getting into your legs, getting into your hands and arms, and so on. That would largely be quite different from just listening alone. Perhaps you would still tap your foot or clap your hands along with music that you might listen to, but the attention that would be required to voluntarily move to the music in a way that playing would require, arguably would have a different type of benefit. I would suggest that that synchronization would create more opportunity going forward for the body and mind to coordinate with one another more directly. And I would imagine this is something that's testable. Of course, there are examples, but in the spaces of aging and in the spaces of neurodegeneration, there's still quite a bit of work to be done to discern all the different types of benefits that can come from different types of music interventions, listening and engaging being two examples of those types of interventions. Then from there, levels of detail can be applied.
Seem to recall the singer Tony Bennett had Alzheimer's, but he still performed. That
Mhm. Yes. Wow. And most recently, wasn't it? He was on tour with Lady Gaga. And if I remember correctly from reading and also watching one or more of their performances, Tony had a lot of difficulty with uh, backstage communication, the scheduling, the planning, the being ready to do what he needed to do because of the disease process, right? It strips away abilities to maintain that short-term memory, the working memory, the ability to keep in mind what needs to take place. But when he went in front of the microphone and someone asked him, "Hey, Tony," and I don't know, excuse me for not knowing exactly what was stated to Tony Bennett at the moment, but like he immediately would start to sing in exactly the right time, with exactly the right intonation, with exactly the right attention to detail that was required. perhaps because of, as you had asked before or mentioned, Dr. Trammell, if we engage with music throughout our life course, even something like Alzheimer's disease cannot take away the ability for an individual like Tony Bennett to step in front of that microphone and do exactly what he knows how to do. It's a remarkable example of the muscle memory. I'm sure you guys are familiar with that phrase, that music can create for someone. So, and in fact, I think this is a really, really interesting point from the understanding that I have of Alzheimer's disease progression. The motor areas of the brain are the last to be, if at all, affected by disease process. This suggests perhaps why, in Tony Bennett's case, he was still able to step up to the mic and physically produce the sounds that he produced that his body and mind had known for so long, without him having to have extra levels of attention to create those sounds. It's such a brilliant example.
I think there are maybe time for two more. So someone did ask, how do people sing and remember hymns, though having been diagnosed with dementia? And I think that our discussion of Tony Bennett really addressed that.
Mhm.
And someone asked, how does dancing to music relate to this?
Well, I think for that, we can turn back to John at the beginning of our session today. I mean, it's very important for me to state that I am not a dancer, certainly not in the sense of, which is that I take that back. That's poorly stated. All of us are dancers, all of us are musicians. Whether or not we think that we are good dancers or good musicians, maybe is an important qualifier, but the ability that we have to synchronize our movements to this external sound, music, right? I would imagine all of us in some level, to our own degree and to our own goals from movement to sound, was accomplished in some way in coordination with John's lesson at the beginning of our session. So dance arguably very much associates with music and brain health because of that coordination, because of that synchronization that occurs not only internally in our own body and minds, but synchronizing with others, right? This is something that here comes some really interesting research, actually. There's an entire discipline called biomusicology, which has a sub-component or is related to evolutionary musicology. And some of the arguments behind the work done there is that our species, right, Homo sapiens, have been engaging with musical sound for as long as our species has been evolving. This suggests for over 1 million years. In fact, there's a book called A Million Years of Music. The author is Tomlinson, and he speaks to these dynamics, that the development of our musicality, our musical capacity, very much is ingrained with who we are as a species. So I would suggest that engaging with music, engaging with dance, simply taps into something that we've been doing for our entire existence. It's a much larger thought process. You know, we only have this much of the iceberg that's exposed visually. Much of it is something that we simply do as a species.
So, Dr. Culberson, one more. Can you clarify for our audience, is muscle memory or is music memory, is it the same as cognitive reserve or is it different?
I think it's important to say that those are different. I would suggest that musical memory, muscle memory, could associate with cognitive reserve. And that herein lies some of the examples. Dr. Trammell, you had mentioned before about individuals who engage with music throughout their life course, particularly those who make music, may have more cognitive reserve than individuals who don't. And this is an assumption. I mean, there's a lot of information that's probably missing there. But one thing that we can say is that the brains of musicians, I think this is a fact, are different than brains of non-musicians. And by saying musicians, what I'm referring to is individuals who regularly practice music in some way. Perhaps they play an instrument, perhaps they sing, Perhaps they listen very intently to music and try and think about what they're listening to, critical listening. Perhaps they make music through composition or arrangement. There's been quite a few studies, particularly Gottfried Schlaug is an example of an individual who's looked at differences between musicians and non-musicians in what's called white matter integrity or white matter innervation. And white matter are the tracts in our brains that connect different regions of the brain, right? These are, perhaps you guys have heard this term synapses. Well, white matter are the examples of how those synapses are interacting with one another with our gray matter. Gray matter are the cells themselves where activity sort of commences and progresses in the brain, and the white matter are ways that those are connected. So his studies have shown that musicians have more white matter in certain regions of the brain than non-musicians. This may associate with cognitive reserve. This may associate with the possibility for musicians to have better outcomes as they age than non-musicians in certain cognitive domains, perhaps like working memory, attention, processing speed, and others.
That is truly fascinating and impressive. So, Dr. Colverson, thank you again for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you.